Hello and welcome to The Point. I'm Marcel Wieder, coming to you from our new studio in downtown Toronto. It's been 4 months since the municipal election that featured transit and gridlock as the main issues. We'll talk with TTC Chair and City Councillor Josh Colle and infrastructure and transit expert Ian Connery on what Toronto is doing to improve transit. And in a few weeks, Finance Minister Charles Sousa is set to unveil his provincial budget. We're joined by Alison Smith from Queen's Park today. All that and more on this edition of The Point. John Tory rode to victory on a campaign of getting Toronto moving. His platform, called Smart Track, called for significant investments in transit. Now, 4 months later, Council approved over $2 million to study the Mayor's plan. To delve into the issue, we are joined by TTC Chair and Eglinton Lawrence Councillor Josh Colle and by Aurora Strategy Group's Ian Connery, who has advised international engineering firms on transit and infrastructure investments. I'm joined with Councillor Josh Colle from Eglinton Lawrence and TTC Chair. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Councillor Colle, maybe you can share some of your vision, both from a long-term and a short-term, of how you see transit being tackled here in Toronto.
Happy to. I think what I've discovered in the short time in this role and watching as a councillor before that is that we've really shirked our responsibility in kind of what I think is the bread and butter of transit and moving people in the city. And it's much on the operations and service side. And we really get excited or distracted sometimes by all the, drawing lines on napkins of what the latest, route or expansion should be, which is important. But at the same time, I think we've neglected our core service and our core responsibility, which is keeping the system maintained and modernized and making sure that we're actually moving people. And I think right now we're teetering in an area where we've tilted to one side where we're not effectively moving people, and our reliability is down, and our service standards aren't where they should be. So I think that's where we need to invest in and focus on, and certainly that's where I hope I will lead the Commission over the next 4 years.
Now, you recently introduced a transit commitment to users. Can you discuss a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. We with this coming budget, city budget, we felt there was an opportunity to, with Mayor Tory and myself, to recognize and invest in some of the areas where people have been calling for improvements. And so that will see really a historic investment in the TTC and transit of almost $100 million. Much of that goes to, sometimes not seen as sexy projects, but, adding more frequent bus service and streetcar service on our routes. Getting a few more subway cars on the Yonge line during rush hour, so you can deal with some of that, that sardine cramming that you see in our peaks, but also things like express routes. Which is, I think, a much cheaper and efficient way to move a large number of people than introducing express routes, more night service, off-peak service. We recognize in a city like Toronto, not everyone just travels in the traditional rush hours, and our buses and streetcars in those other times are becoming quite full. And so adding service there too. And then the other part of it was introducing that children 12 and under will now ride free, which is much more, I would say, social policy than transit policy, but I think an important step from a transit perspective in building ridership and building kind of the next generation of people who will use transit and actually be ambassadors for the TTC.
Now, you talked about investing in the routes and things like that, and one of the mentions is streetcars. And I note that the new flat level modern streetcars that the TTC ordered, there's just, I think, 3 of them on the Spadina line, and we haven't seen very many rolled out anywhere else in the city.
Yeah, it's been incredibly frustrating. That was one of the first things kind of I saw when I sat in the chair was, we've ordered 200 of these streetcars at the cost of almost $1 billion, which was a decision made by a previous council. But, now that we have made that investment and commitment, we need to see these on the road. And I think that while initially we received some assurances from Bombardier that things were happening, that wasn't good enough. And so we've pressed them. They've given us a new schedule, a new delivery schedule. So we should see the 4th is here. We should see 30 by year end. But in my mind, that's still probably too little.
Now it begs the question of who's able to pay for all this. We saw that the province committed $15 billion to the Greater Toronto Hamilton area for transit. We've seen that the feds have only given some money for the Scarborough extension and legacy from the gas tax. So where are we going to get the money to finance this?
Yeah. At a certain point, I think there's obviously the foundation pieces you have to do. We have to replace our track. We have to improve our signaling system. But if there's any real conversation that anyone wants to have about expansion and really taking our service to the next level like we see in other cities, it has to be 3 levels of government. There is no, and I'm going to sound like a broken record for previous people in this position, there is no system in the Western world that relies so much on the fare box like we do and on the city level of government. It's just not sustainable. And if you want proof that it's not sustainable, look at all our delays now in the morning rush, and that's because of a track system and a signaling system that's 60 years old and hasn't had that investment. So we need all 3 levels of government. I'm open to being creative. I'm open to different financing models. Maybe we can deliver projects differently on the capital side by looking at private partners to do that with us. So I think that's something we have to look at. We have to leave no stone unturned. But I think we're kidding people if we think that the city can do it alone.
After the break, Ian Connery joins Josh Colle as we continue our discussion on transit in Toronto. We're joined by Ian Connery, who's advised international engineering firms on transit and infrastructure. Ian, from your experience, what other opportunities or models are there for transit systems to bring in new revenues? As the councillor was saying, he's open to new ideas. What have you seen?
Well, the best examples are, one of them is actually very nearby, New York City, where the recent expansion of the subway, Line 7, is almost entirely funded by the private sector in the form of, let's make it simple, a payback after the buildings are built. In other words, they call it value capture, but what that means is that they're given air rights over, in this case, a rail yard, and after they build the buildings, the anticipation is that, of course, there's tax revenue, and that will more than pay for the cost of the other infrastructure that's needed to move around the rail lines, etc. And it's working. Another example is in London, England, where they're doing the same thing, again, building over an old rail yard using the air rights above. And Chicago has a couple of small examples like that, Hong Kong. So these models are around the world, and they are working. And it allows, what you need to do is you have to have a partnership between the private sector and governments of all levels. And I look at Toronto, and I know that there's a plan to do some of that along the Eglinton corridor that's being built. But I say, why not do it everywhere?
I'm thinking, Councillor, of one particular station, just a random one, is Bathurst in Bloor, where you have right beside a major thoroughfare, you have a bus and you have a subway, and there's nothing built above it. It's just open skies.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned Bathurst, because I often cite that one as the example that 60 years after the line's been built, and there's development around the site, we have this land that has basically nothing on it. And how are we utilizing or leveraging that? And in that case, we're not. One interesting thing about the way the TTC and the City of Toronto and that relationship on kind of capturing some of that land value is that technically the TTC would have to declare that land surplus, and it goes to Build Toronto. There are many other systems around the world where if you look at their kind of non-fare revenue, their biggest source of non-fare revenue is real estate. Where we've kind of been handcuffed from that, and I get why we're all one city and these are sister agencies, why they might want to do it, but I think it's something we have to look at carefully and have that money, if not kept by the TTC, at least earmarked back for transit. So as a site at Bathurst and Bloor or at Yonge and Eglinton or Eglinton West Station gets developed, the thought of all that just going to general revenues I think is a bit off. I think you have to ensure that some of those transit lands or that transit infrastructure, if you're going to leverage it, that those funds go back into enhancing transit service.
And one thing, Ian, internationally, and you cited London, New York, and Chicago, is that they seem to approach it on a regional basis. In Toronto, we have a hodgepodge of different transit systems. So we have the TTC, and then we have Mississauga and Brampton and Vaughan and a whole slew of different regional entities. How is that going to work? Is it
around the world where it works best is where transportation and transit is seen as a regional issue. London, New York are good examples. Three of the worst examples in the world are Montreal, Toronto, and Chicago. You need to take a regional approach. There was legislation introduced in Quebec a couple of years ago, but there was a government change. They were going to amalgamate all of the, I think it's 35 agencies that are responsible for moving people around the island of Montreal. It's got to be done, and it should be done here in Toronto. It's got to be done on a regional basis. Metrolinx is a good start, but in a way it's a toothless tiger. I think that we need to get a buy-in, of course, from all the municipalities, because you can't just impose something unless Vancouver is a good model where they did meet and work out a system that everybody was somewhat happy with. There are a few people still not happy about it, but on the whole, the Vancouver model, I think, is a good one.
And how would you react if Metrolinx were to take over the TTC and the GTHA transit system?
Well, I think there's no doubt that we have to have the regional focus, and I mean that's what Metrolinx was invented for. I don't think they've quite delivered on that yet. At the same time, they're not operators, and I think what we have to start having a discussion around is who does what best. And I'm quite comfortable with expansion and big capital projects being done that way. But maybe the TTC, we have the operating experience. Maybe we should be looking at being the umbrella agency to take on that Brampton or Mississauga transit. I'm sure the local politicians would hate to hear that, but I think we have to have a clearer sense of who does what in the region and where the expertise lies. And so Metrolinx has never delivered a project. We'll see how Eglinton works, and I'm very enthusiastic, especially because it goes through my ward. But at the same time, we have to look at who's best to do each of these tasks, and I think you can still divide it up that way, but still have that regional focus, but some clarity. I think the clarity is not there right now. Who plans transit in this city? Is it Metrolinx? Is it the province? Is it a minister's decree? Is it our planning department? Is it the TTC? And so while we have, I think, a lot of the tools and organizations in place, there has to be kind of a grown-up conversation about who does what, and that will help us move forward, I think.
Now, we haven't had really much of a conversation on Mayor Tory's Smart Track proposal. And I understand Council has approved funds to start studying it. How long is it going to take from the study to actual implementation?
Well, I think the one of the benefits of this plan is it really is leveraging existing work that's being done by the province to better utilize infrastructure that's in place. It's it's a regional rail plan that looks at, hey, you've got tracks on the GO system. Can we not use that for more frequent commuter service? And so the province is already doing that, and Smart Track kind of adds that overlay. The piece that will take some more time and has decisions around it to be made is what happens on Eglinton. And whether you are to continue a Smart Track, regional rail, heavy rail system out to Pearson Airport, or if you're to look at some of the existing plans that are in place that would see surface a lighter rail. And so the work that's being done on kind of that city piece is happening right now and will be done in the next year. All the work on the regional system continues with the province and the city, and the expectation is that will start delivering results in the coming years. I mean, the mayor's given a 7-year time frame, but I think the real piece where there's some uncertainty, and what these reports will tell us, is what happens on Eglinton.
How do other jurisdictions handle this?
Well, the best example that I always like to cite is New York State, where a number of years ago the governor simply said, let's get this out of the hands of the local politicians and the legislature. And he appointed an agency statewide with the ability to look at transit and transportation needs and go ahead and build. And they had the power to toll. And of course, anyone who's been to Manhattan lately, that toll you pay coming across from the airport has long since paid for that bridge. And that money goes to new works across the state. And we used to have tolls here, even in Toronto, when I like to cite that when Kingston Road was first built, it was a toll road. Mm-hmm. And in Montreal, roads and bridges were tolled until recently. And then an election comes up, and somebody takes the tolls off because it's popular. You've got to pay for the new construction. And in other jurisdictions, it's pretty clear that people are ready for a central agency that will just have the expertise and the ability to go ahead and do it.
Mm-hmm. So, Councillor Colle, I'll give you the last word. What's the price of inaction?
I mean, that's what we're living with. I mean, and I'll tell you a local story that isn't well known. You know, the Eglinton subway that was being built that was filled in the 90s, we just reached the point now, basically 30 years later, where our tunnel boring machines met the concrete that was filled in back then. And so if you ever want to, see what the price of inaction is, look along Eglinton West and see what hasn't happened, how the area hasn't been developed, not to mention the cost of congestion and all the things that we know hurt our economy and our quality of life. So I think we have to start looking at that and factoring that in. It's harder to quantify that number, but what is that price of not doing something? And I think that should compel us to get over this, which project's better, this one, Project A or Project B? My opinion is do them both, because the opportunity cost is so high that you're better off doing them both. Maybe they're delivered differently and financed differently, but I think we have to move forward and stop, dithering and bickering about which is the perfect project and move forward.
I'm joined by TTC Chair Josh Colle and Aurora Strategy Group's Ian Connery. We'll be back in a moment.